Pharma's Global Health and Nutrition Network. We appreciate you being here for our 19th Supply Side West, and certainly attending our first time having a vitamin K2 workshop. I would like to thank our underwriters for this event: Kappa Bioscience, Natto Pharma USA, Nutriland USA, PLT Health Solutions, Sungen Biosciences, and Virdis Biopharma. A reminder, and I'm going to have to remind myself when I get back to my chair, I'm sure you all have lovely ringtones as I do, but if you could place your mobile device in silent mode, that would be appreciated. You will be receiving an email from us. Toward the middle of this coming week, it's going to have a link where you can actually click and then download the presentation. So feel free to take lots of notes, take pictures of the screen, but do know that we'll be sending you that information. And we'll have 4 speakers today. You should have received an agenda when you came in the door. We'll have 2 sessions, a short break, and then 2 more sessions. Overall, we'll have 4 speakers: Dr. Dennis Goodman, Professor Ted Reid, Leon Sugars, and Katrina Meres. Close? Close. So our first speakers before our break, first will be Dennis Goodman. He's the Director of Integrative Medicine at New York University, where he also serves as Clinical Associate Professor and Cardiologist in the Department of Cardiology and Preventive Medicine. He's board certified in cardiology, internal medicine, lipidology, cardiac CT imaging, and integrative medicine, and graduated cum laude with distinction from the University of Cape Town Medical School in Cape Town, South Africa. He's published many articles, in addition to 3 books on heart health, including Vitamin K2, the Missing Nutrient for Heart and Bone Health. Our second speaker in our first section will be Professor and Director of Biotechnology at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, Ted Reid, who obtained his bachelor's in chemistry from Occidental College, a master's in chemistry from the University of Arizona, and his doctorate in biochemistry from UCLA. He served as an assistant professor and associate professor at Yale University, a professor at UC Davis, and is currently at Texas Tech, serving as the Director of Biotechnology. He has over 100 publications, 200 abstracts, and 21 U.S. and foreign patents. And Dr. Goodman, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thanks, Heather. Thank you.
And I'll make one additional note. We are videotaping this session, so if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I'm going to find you with the microphone so we make sure that our speakers and the rest of you can hear that.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for getting up. I know 8:30 in the morning is early if you're in Vegas. I want to thank Heather, other organizers. I've had a lot of email with Shyla. Please, I don't see her here, but please thank her. Incredible organization and organizational skills, and I'm really honored to be here. This is a very, very exciting time because I am a traditionally trained physician, and I have spent the last few years really getting to understand what integrative medicine is about. And this is one of the pearls that I discovered, vitamin K2. So I'm going to be focusing really on the clinical aspects of vitamin K2 and how I got to get interested in this and why I'm really excited about it. So this is a slide that just shows you some of my journey. I was actually born in South Africa, and I went to medical school in Cape Town. And if you look, I was looking for the red pointer. But on the far left is Groote Schuur Hospital, where they did the first heart transplant, Christian Barnard, 1967. And that's where I went to medical school and trained. And then I landed up coming to the United States, and I landed up at Baylor College of Medicine, which is the next picture, where I actually was training with Michael DeBakey. So I landed up having these 2 giants as mentors. And then I went to, I was actually at that UPC, is where I went to residency in Pittsburgh, and then I was at Scripps Memorial, and then I was at Scripps Integrated Medicine, and now I'm at NYU. And I really want to say how exciting it is that NYU's actually realized that integrative medicine is so important, and they've actually appointed me as the director to try to make some inroads. And as you can imagine, it's not easy convincing traditional medicine doctors that we have other options. To give you an example, I asked our rheumatologist if he's heard of vitamin K2 and why he isn't using it, and I won't tell you what he said. You can ask me afterwards, but I don't even think he knew about it. So this is a book that after getting very excited about vitamin K2, I decided to try to do what we're all trying to do. The only way the word's going to get out is if we get educated. And with some help from Kate, who's sitting over there, we wrote this book about, very simply, what is vitamin K2 and why is it important? And why is it important clinically? And this book is actually out there. It's on Amazon. I can't tell you how many emails I get every week from all over the world. People that are excited and starting to understand that maybe some of their problems are related to the fact that they've actually never taken vitamin K2, and maybe we could have prevented some of these problems. So you're going to hear more about this from Dr. Schergers, but basically vitamin K2 is part of the vitamin K family, and everybody knows about vitamin K1 because vitamin K1 is really important for coagulation. It's a fat-soluble vitamin, and it's required for production of the coagulation factors 2, 7, 9, and 10. And warfarin, Coumadin, which we use a lot of as an anticoagulant, antagonizes K1. So you can imagine that when you take K1 and you've got warfarin on board, you actually land up having less efficacy of warfarin. And so everybody understands that there's K1 in vegetables, I'm going to show you in a minute, and we should not be taking K1 with warfarin. But K2 is part of the family, and you're going to hear the story. I'll show you in a minute. The difference with K1 and K2 is really the number of carboxyl groups, and there's MK4 and MK7, and you're going to hear all about it, but it's crucial to understand that it's the MK7 form of vitamin K2 that's important. That's where the studies have done. MK7, as you'll see here, has a longer half-life. It gets through the liver, and it's got a half-life of 3 days. So it's extremely important if you're going to, and you should, be putting vitamin K supplementation. I'll talk to you about in a minute about the groups I recommended, that you use the MK7 form. So here you see sources of vitamin K2. As I mentioned, K1, green leafy vegetables, the MENA-Q7, the MENA-quinones, the K2, found in fermented cheeses, and this natto soy that they've got in Japan. It actually is not really palatable for Western diets, but people who do eat this, and they sell it in New York, a lot of Japanese people come and find it, and there are studies that have shown that people who eat a lot of fermented soy actually have a lower incidence of heart disease and osteoporosis. So the interesting thing here on the next slide is that you can see just a little example of where do we get dietary sources of K1 and K2. Well, you can get lots of K1, you can get lots of K1 from your leafy vegetables, but how do you get vitamin K2? The actual body does make some K2, but you can see the only way to get a sufficient amount from your diet is to eat this fermented soy. Or a lot of cheeses that are fermented, and unfortunately that's another story, because if you eat a lot of cheeses, then your cardiologist is going to say that's not good either. So you really can't get enough in your diet, and it means supplementation. So this is a slide that really tells us, which is really the key point of what MK7 vitamin K2 does. And we know, and you're going to hear about it, that vitamin K2 is so important because what it does is it takes calcium, which is in arteries or can deposit in arteries, and it sends it to the bone. So the key point is that when we take calcium, when we take vitamin D, we want calcium to get into the bones so that you can build bone and strengthen bone. And vitamin K2, I'm very proud of myself because I came up with this image, and someone helped me make a beautiful slide. And this is how I explain it to patients. You can have calcium around, and we all think it's important to take calcium, but if the calcium doesn't land up where it's supposed to be in the bones, it lands up in the arteries. So, for example, a lot of postmenopausal women who've already got problems with osteoporosis, what do the doctors say when they see a DEXA scan with a mild abnormality? Oh, you must take some more calcium. What actually happens is that calcium's got nowhere to go unless you've got vitamin K2 on board. I was just reading on the plane yesterday, it's really fascinating. The British Medical Journal came out with an article from Dr. Boland, who's from Auckland in New Zealand, saying they've looked at a meta-analysis of multiple studies, and they're now saying women don't really need calcium. That, in fact, it's not been helpful. There may be a 10% reduction in risk for fractures. So his point was, we really don't need to recommend it. And there was a little place at the bottom where you could send a comment. And I said, what about K2? To make the case that we don't need calcium, that's not the, to me, that's not the right message. You can't give the calcium without K2, vitamin D, and magnesium. They work together. It's a quartet. You can't have the quartet playing properly if two of the members are missing. So I think it's really important, and the patients, I explain to them, this is like an usher. Vitamin K2 helps the calcium get where it's supposed to go. So this is just to tell you, what is vitamin K2 doing? It's turning on these enzymes that actually make MGP and osteocalcin work. And MGP takes calcium, doesn't allow it to get into the vessels, and osteocalcin is in bone, and it keeps the calcium there. So this point is this is the whole point, that you need osteocalcin to be activated, you need MGP activated so that they can work, and if you don't have vitamin K2, you can't carboxylate the enzymes that's required to activate them. So here you see, again, vitamin K2 switches on MGP, inhibiting calcium mineralization in the arteries. This is a study. We always like to look to the literature, and this is a study from Osteoporosis International 213. These references are here, and showing that women who had a high dietary vitamin K2 intake had less osteoporosis. And so that's really important. We need to do proper, we're trying. I think the point is so important in traditional medicine for traditional doctors to take something on board. They want to see these big double-blind randomized studies, and they want them presented at major meetings, and then they start to go, okay, I get it. So it's really hard, and I make the point all the time. I'd like to see all the actual manufacturers coming together and saying, let's really try to do something where we can prove that if you take calcium without vitamin K, you're getting into trouble. Vitamin K2. So the next slide is really dear to my heart and near to my heart, which is the cardiology story. There's lots of stuff out there in the literature. Dr. Churgis is a real expert, and Kate, about osteoporosis. And what I find fascinating, which a lot of doctors don't associate, when I see women with osteoporosis, I'm so focused now on the fact that they may be vitamin K2 deficient, I'm screening them, and I find they've got calcium in their arteries. So a lot of the stuff that's been coming out over the years about why is there increased calcification in people taking calcium. There was such a debate about it. People were really freaked out about it. How can this be? And then we started to make the recommendation, cut back on the amount of calcium. Don't take more than 1,200. But in fact, the problem, I think, was that people were calcifying their arteries because they were vitamin K2 deficient. So this is a study that Dr. Churgis was involved in, and this was one of those studies with 16,000 women aged 49 to 7. This is an observational study, really exciting, because what it showed is that people who had dietary K2, the more K2 you took, the less chance you were going to have of calcification, heart attacks, cardiovascular mortality, and overall mortality. There was a 50% reduction in cardiovascular events in people who had the highest levels of vitamin K2. And it wasn't measured, not the highest levels, the highest dietary intake. And the mortality was down 25%. So this was one of these things, didn't really hit traditional medicine, but this was a huge pointer that something exciting is very, very happening with vitamin K2. This is another study looking at 16,000 European women, ages 49 to 17, no cardiovascular disease at baseline. And here again, the study showed that for every 10 micrograms of vitamin K2 intake, additional 10 microgram, there was a reduction in cardiovascular risk by 9%. So the studies are there. When people talk to me and I start talking to my group in prevention, I say the studies are there. You need to, when we start looking at things that are coming into the future of our understanding of how things are important, you've got to look at what's out there. And the more stuff that comes out there, the more we realize there really is something to it. Now, this is one of the most exciting studies. It was published earlier this year. This is one of the first times that we have this randomized study that we think that it's so important, which was that postmenopausal women They were either on placebo or they were on 180 micrograms of the MENA-Q7 form, really important, for 3 years, and they were able to show that the group, and here you can see, you see the group who got the MENA-Q7 in red had better flexibilities of their arteries. So that is an indicator of endothelial function. We know that when people have early atherosclerosis, the function of their endothelium, the ability of an artery to constrict and relax, is impaired. This is one of the early markers for atherosclerosis. I use it all the time in some patients trying to see whether or not, in fact, they've already got early atherosclerosis. So this is extremely exciting. Congratulate the Dr. Sugar's people who did the study, because this is the first time we're getting a clinical study with a double-blind randomized trial. Extremely exciting. And now what we have to start to do, and we are going to do, and Dr. Sugar's will tell you, is look at clinical events. When we show that there really are a reduction in heart attacks and strokes and less fractures, clinically, when you have one group on vitamin K2 supplementation and one group not, it'll be huge. The only problem with that at this point is I'm a believer. So when you ask me to go into a study like that and randomize my patients so that they wouldn't get vitamin K2, do we have an ethical problem? And that's for debate later on. Because if you're a believer, you really don't want to do that. But in fact, I think for the sake of science and basically getting the world to understand how important it is, I would be very much in favor of a study like that. So let me just touch, because I'm a cardiologist, on something that's really important to understand. Atherosclerosis starts to develop sometimes in teens. They've actually shown some plaques in fetuses. It's hard to believe, in mothers with familial hyperlipidemia. But the point I want to show you is it takes years to develop atherosclerosis. And you can see what I wanted to show you here is that as you develop atherosclerosis, you start to get this lipid deposit inside the artery, and over years it gets to a point where it can become obstructed. So when it gets to about 70% obstructed, you start to have symptoms. People don't have symptoms. They don't have angina, they don't have shortness of breath because of ischemia if they have blockages less than 70% in general. So what happens is that when patients are symptomatic, we can go, okay, well, let's have a look, and we often find they've got obstructive coronary disease. The problem is, why are half the patients who die of a heart attack, why is it their first and last symptom? And so what's happening in those patients is this. They can have a 50% lesion, a 40% stenosis, but what actually happens is it ruptures. And when this lipid pool gets in contact with blood, you get coagulation, you get a thrombus, it occludes the artery, and that's what a heart attack is. So I want to make this point. When somebody says to you, I don't understand how this happened because the person saw a cardiologist last week and they had a stress test, it was normal. When we do a stress test to tell somebody that they're fine is a mistake. You can tell them, you did well, you do not have obstructive coronary disease. But in fact, diffuse non-obstructive coronary disease carries a bad prognosis. So I'm going to tell you, how do we screen these people? How do we know who out there has vulnerable plaques, who is at risk? So this is just to show you a microscopic view here, and you can see this is the lipid pool over here, and this thing here we call the fibrous cap. When the fibrous cap is thin, it's easier for it to rupture. And so we believe that there's certain medications that can, quote, stabilize the plaque, like statins. That was one of the belief systems we had. So it wasn't just that they're lowering LDL, they're doing something, a pleomorphic effect that stabilizes the plaque. And there are other people who have said that maybe some of the ACE inhibitors and ARBs also stabilize plaque. Why are we so concerned about this? Because we don't want plaques to rupture. So this is from 10 years ago, really exciting, and I want to bring to your attention what I use a lot in my practice. What screening test do I use to try to pick up people that have subclinical atherosclerosis? And what it is something called a calcium scan. So a calcium scan is something, it's a CT scan, it takes exactly 2 minutes, and we can tell whether there's calcium in the arteries. And we have got multiple studies that show when there's calcium in the arteries, the prognosis is worse. The higher the calcium score, because we can score it by the computer, they're called Agatston units, we can actually see whether or not someone has a lot of atherosclerosis. So if someone has a score over 400, that patient's got at least a 25 to 35% chance of having a blocked artery. So all those patients are put on stress tests. What's so fascinating, I'm really excited about this. I read this yesterday. There's a trial called the MESA trial that looks at asymptomatic patients. They're trying to figure out what should we put these patients on that are high risk and see how they do over years. And they figured out that if you use calcium scanning, then 50% of people taking statins wouldn't need them. And this is how I practice. I look at people who are moderate, intermediate risk. They've got a family history. Maybe they're 55 years old, and they've been put on a statin because they have high cholesterol. And they either have symptoms or they don't want to take it. I say, let's do a calcium scan. And when the score is 0, and you're 55, 60 years old, you don't need a statin, in my opinion. So unfortunately, I don't know where this is going to be, but if it's on the web, then you are putting me at risk. Because I'm going to say that I think way too much statin use without being sure that patients all need it. The guidelines show that if you've got a 10-year risk of above 7.5%, you should be on a statin. Well, it turns out elderly patients get such a high score that most of them have an indication for a statin. So I think what we've got to start to do is say, do you have plaque? So I use this calcium scan a lot, and if patients don't have plaque, I do not feel compelled to put them on a statin, except in certain situations, obviously for familial hyperlipidemia and things like that. What's the other way we can look for asymptomatic plaque? And it's this. We can see the IMT. This is an ultrasound up here on the far left of the carotid. We call that the carotid IMT thickness. Sorry. We can measure intimal thickness in the carotid. So I use these non-invasive screening techniques. I see so many people, and a lot of women who come to me, they've got a high LDL cholesterol of 160, a total cholesterol of 250, and they have been put on a statin. And they've got an HDL that's very high, that's the good cholesterol. And I go, and they say, I don't want to take it. I said, well, let's see if you've got plaque. Let's look at your intimal thickness. If we're seeing signs of atherosclerosis developing and you're 50 years old, I say take it or take something. We can talk about that somewhere else, but I've got no problem. So here's somebody, and you can see, this is a calcium scan, and you can see the calcium there, and that's how we detect it. This is the calcium actually in the arteries. Just showing you some pictures of this. So I just wanted to show you something really exciting. This article came out in about February this year, and it was in the expert review of clinical pharmacology. Most people didn't see this, but a friend of mine sent it to me, and what was so amazing is that these authors are looking at the effects of statins on various things, and they found out that statins deplete the amount of CoQ10. We know that because it blocks the same pathway that produces CoQ10. But what was fascinating is that it also inhibits the ability of the body to make vitamin K2. Now, what would that mean? If statins are inhibiting the ability of the body to make K2, then based on everything I'm saying here and everything we all think, we should be seeing increased calcification. Because now you're getting, so the statins may land up increasing calcification. Now, if you had to tell, traditional medicine that, they would have, well, no, how does that make sense? Because we think calcium's not so good, that it's a reflection of how much plaque you have. And then this study came out in JACC, in the Journal of American College of Cardiology, saying that people on high-intensity statins had increased calcification. That means the calcium scores were higher. This has created absolute furor and havoc because people started to go, how does this work? And then, so they had to try to explain this. And people wrote about the mechanisms, and there was a theory that maybe it's good. Because if you calcify more, maybe you're calcifying these fibrous plaques, and then there's less chance of rupture. So that came into this whole debate about, well, is this a way that statin works? You decrease atheroma. Now, let me just show you this. Just look at the blue and the red. We know, and these are patients on high-intensity statins, low-intensity statins, and no statins, HISTs, high-intensity statins. And they showed that the amount of atheroma is reduced on a statin. That means the lipid pool's reduced. It's not just, there's other stuff in the atherosclerotic plaque besides calcium. So that was reduced, But if you look at the red thing, the red here represents calcification. And look what happened to calcification in the high-intensity statins. You got reduction in atheroma, the volume of the atheroma, but you got increased calcification. And I can tell you the jury's not out. We don't really know. But I think it's extremely exciting. And actually, it's a jigsaw puzzle that's coming together, that if you're on a statin, you're probably getting vitamin K2 deficient, if you're not already, and you should add vitamin K2 to every patient on a statin. So I give every patient that I have statins. I am not against statins for people who need them. I use it, really a lot of them, but I put them on CoQ10, and I put them on vitamin K2, and I tell them we've got data. And I put them on magnesium. Those are my three big supplements. And vitamin D if they need it. If they're getting a lot of sun and their vitamin D levels are above 40, I'm okay. But if they're not, they get vitamin D as well. Next slide. So let's just say one word. I know Dr. Sugar is going to talk about this more. Coumadin, I mentioned it to you. Coumadin is warfarin. It antagonizes vitamin K2. It's a potent anticoagulant. But what do you expect if you inhibit vitamin K? And that means inhibiting K1 and K2, because it does both. You'll end up having increased calcification in patients who are on Coumadin. People in Europe don't put renal failure patients on Coumadin, even with atrial fibrillation, because they have such an increase in calcification. We don't want to give a drug to prevent a stroke or thrombosis if it's going to increase atherosclerosis. So we're lucky today in that we have a new class of agent called the novel oral anticoagulants. They work through a different mechanism, through thrombin inhibition and factor 10 inhibition, and the initial studies are showing that this is not a problem if you take vitamin K2, vitamin K1 and K2. That's why we tell people on these drugs. You've heard of Pradaxa and Rivaroxaban and Xarelto and Eliquis. These are the novel anticoagulants. We're using them now as much as possible in patients who have atrial fibrillation without valvular heart disease. And we tell them you can go and eat as much vegetables as you like, because it's not a vitamin K mechanism. And it may well, and so I feel comfortable in saying if you're on a NOAC, you can take K2. If you're on Coumadin, can you take vitamin K2? Well, I've read, and Dr. Sugar's actually told me that a lot of the physicians out in Europe are using up to 45 micrograms per day. Maybe he can comment about that. I will not put a patient on Coumadin and vitamin K2. And the reason is I don't know what, even if there's some studies that point to the fact that it's, quote, safe, I don't want to have any patient, God forbid, have a stroke or a major cardiac event, and then they say, somebody says, probably a lawyer, you caused it by putting them on vitamin K2. So in my practice, I use vitamin K2 on the patients who are getting the NOACs and not on patients on warfarin. But I'm concerned about them because they're increasing calcification. We know that. So we have to make absolutely sure we're doing everything else to avoid that. And those are patients, clearly, that you want to be very, very vigilant about risk factor modification. So here are the differences, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to show you, here are the differences between these new oral anticoagulants and Coumadin, and you can see that here you can see the difference in terms of the vitamin K story. So here are vitamin K2 intake requirements. Most people are deficient. Most of the Western diet's deficient. I've told you this. It turns out if you even get up to 32 micrograms a day, you reduce arterial calcification, you reduce cardiovascular mortality. That was from the Rotterdam study. And clinical trials have shown that 180 micrograms is the effective dose. That's what I use. So I use 180 micrograms, and I tell people to try to find a supplement that's got vitamin D plus K2 in it, because this makes it easier, and there are out there. I'm not supposed to mention names, but if you come here, I'll tell you which ones I use. It doesn't matter. You want to go with MenoQ7. It's really, really important that you're getting your vitamin K2 from MenoQ7 and from a reliable manufacturer. So what about the supplements? It's important to supplement. I've told you you can't get enough from your diet. We do not have a blood test to check vitamin K2 levels. You have to actually measure the undercarboxylated MGP or undercarboxylated osteocalcin. It's a research tool. We don't have it. If you try to order it, you can't get it. So until we actually have vitamin K2 levels, a test, we're going to be in the situation where you just have to make an assumption. When vitamin D levels became available, you saw what happened. It's crazy. Every doctor now, as part of a routine lab assessment on their yearly physicals, gets a vitamin D level. And there are fortunes of people on vitamin D because they got a number. Oh, you're below 30. You're below 20. When we get a vitamin K2 assessment that's clinically reliable, I think you're going to see vitamin K2 becoming the next vitamin D. So I'm going to end off, I just want to tell you, what's integrative medicine? What does it mean to me? Why do I feel that I've sort of made a transition from traditional to integrative medicine? And really what it comes to for me is trying to understand that when patients come to me, I don't just want to practice in a disease model, which is, you know what? You don't have a disease, don't worry about it, go home. Come back if you've got another problem, I'll do a yearly physical. We live in a disease model system. Patients come to doctors, they get tested, they get procedures, and we're looking for diseases and we're trying to treat them. But what I focus on every single patient, whether I find something wrong or not, I have a conversation about wellness. And wellness is the art of finding your balance in life. I came up with this image of the jugglers. You've got to bounce all these balls, and you've got to try to keep them all in the air. So I talk about 4 things in every single patient. The problem with this is that it takes time. So unfortunately for me, I'm under stress every single day because someone says to me, you're taking too long with the patients. Because this takes time. And nobody thinks it's important in terms of our payers. They say they think it's important, but they don't want to compensate you for it. So this extra 10 minutes with every patient, when you're seeing 20 patients a day, it's 3 hours. And that's why a lot of physicians have a hard time doing it, because you need time. But I discuss nutrition and supplements with everybody. If you come to my office, I've got a whole lot of supplements on my desk. And patients come and find me from the internet, and they're so happy that I can talk to them about any supplement. And then when they asked me about K2, I said, sure, have you seen my book? And magnesium and other things. But I feel it's so important that we talk about nutrition and supplements. We talk about sleep, exercise and flexibility, and stress management. Sleep is huge, and it's one of the most important pillars for wellness. So I ask every patient, how are you sleeping? Half of them don't sleep well. Half of them are getting nowhere near 7 hours at night. And I screen them for sleep apnea, and I find that 20% have got sleep apnea. So it's a very important component to wellness. You've got to sleep well for your body to heal and repair itself every night. So integrative medicine, just a little bit of a few thoughts. Exercise, eat a healthy, well-balanced diet, rich in these things. We can have a whole conversation about diet. I think we've realized now we made a big mistake to tell everybody you've got to stay on a low-fat diet. It was a mistake. You've got to be on a low-sugar, no-processed food diet. Low-carb if you're trying to lose weight. It's not the fats. The healthy fats, there's nothing wrong with them. Take your vitamins, magnesium, krill oil. Because I told you about this. Reduce stress and sleep properly is one of my favorite slides. So this is just to say, sometimes we don't actually understand why something works. So I've got some of my physician friends who say, well, it sounds like quackery. Okay, when I put someone on magnesium instead of an antihypertensive, I tell them, look, they didn't need it. The blood pressures come down on magnesium. With magnesium, we understand why it works, but there are many things we do, whether it's going on a vibration table or doing acupuncture, that we may not know exactly how it's working, but you feel better. And for me, that's what counts. When a patient says, I feel better, and they're doing better, I don't care if I don't exactly understand how it happened, because there's so much in medicine that we don't actually understand. So just to end off, I wanted to summarize proven benefits with MK7, activates MGP to inhibit calcium from the depositing in the arteries and blood vessels. It reverses arterial stiffness, reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. It improves bone health, and we have no known side effects or safety concerns at this time. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate you having me. I look forward to our conversation.
All right, thank you so much. We've got about 5 minutes for questions, so I've got one here.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. There's a lab that tests uncarboxylated osteocalcin levels, so I think that could correlate with uncarboxylated MGP. So that's, until we have the other test, that could be a nice surrogate test.
Where is it available? I'm just interested because I can't get it in New York. How do I get it? Come talk to
New
me.
York has special
Well,
regulations. I think it's Genova Diagnostics, but that bought Metametrics.
Yeah.
I need to actually double check because there's been a
Please
merger.
Come and talk to me, because if I know where to send it, it's reliable. I'm only too happy to get it. I know that I haven't been able to get it in New York.
Yes.
But I think that would be great if we have a reliable test.
And as a nutritionist, my opinion is that we need both vitamin K1 and K2. I wrote a chapter in a textbook in Natural Medicine, a review of all forms. So I think there are differences, but there are complementary effects. So that's my opinion.
I agree with you. I think the thing about K1 is we get plenty of it in our diet very easily. Now, I have no problem with supplementing with both. I think you're saying we should actually supplement with K1. I think that's an interesting conversation. If someone tells me they're eating a lot of green vegetables, I don't do it. But I'm very interested in other people's opinion. If they're not having a good diet, which most people don't, I have no problem with it. Just be careful in anybody on warfarin. We know that. That's really important. Yes?
Very nice talk. And my name is Ben Yini from University of Kansas Medical Center. I'm not a supplier. I just come here to listen to your talk. And from the preventive standpoint, you mentioned MK7. Is that specific for the cardiovascular disease? Because we know MK4 is the main form in the brain. And then my next question is, from the therapeutic point, do you know, or if you think, if a patient already have a plaque, if you take vitamin K2 or MK7 or 4, can you reduce those plaque? Is that possible to do that? Thank you very much.
They're great questions. Firstly, we know MK4's got an effect in the body. The problem is it's very short acting. And so if you've got a person that's that's basically vitamin K2 deficient, which I'm telling you most people are, the way to get their vitamin K2 levels is up through MenoQ7, because it's long acting. When you give drugs that are short acting, they last 4 hours and they're gone. You don't really want to have to take MenoK4 3 times a day. So that's one reason. The other reason is that it has been shown in the studies, MenoQ7 is where the studies were done, and I'm sure Leon will comment about that. So I think supplementing, you need MenoQ7. In terms of regression of plaque, we haven't seen, I haven't, and I'm not aware of it, I hope you'll talk to this, a proper study that says we're actually seeing plaque regression. That means atheroma regression with intravascular ultrasound. I'm sure that they're looking at that. It would be a wonderful thing to see. Think about mechanisms, though. The mechanism of vitamin K2 on the arteries is to prevent calcification. So your question could be, can we show a reduction in calcification if you give people vitamin K2? My answer is you're probably going to have a hard time doing that. It's hard to reduce calcium, if at all. I mean, you've got it like cement. It's not going anywhere. But what you can do is retard progression. You can prevent further calcification. Thank you for coming, and I really appreciate it. I really feel inspired when we have Western, really trained physicians saying, let's hear about this, because that's what this is all about, and that's why I'm excited to be here. We need a bridge between complementary and traditional medicine, because otherwise we're not going to know what's going on both sides. But I think traditional medicine, when we get this puzzle and we put it together so it's a proper picture, I think you'll see that they'll take on board vitamin K2 the way they do vitamin D. Anything else?
Yes, thank you so much for a very enlightening discussion. Most of us in this room are going to have to answer the question of what is a safe dose for somebody who is on an oral coagulating agent. And I was a little confused jotting down as many notes as I did. If you have someone that is on an inhibitor, what could they be supplementing with K2?
Okay, so just to summarize, there's warfarin, which is Coumadin, right, which is a vitamin K1 antagonist.
Yes, that's that.
Okay, I do not recommend it to use K2 in a patient on warfarin. I told you why. Now, Dr. Schergers, please ask him that question, because I think in Europe they're okay with a small dose, like 45 micrograms, as long as you stay on a consistent diet. You're not changing your vegetable and green leafy vegetable intake. My problem is I understand that it may well be safe. It kind of makes sense. It's a very low dose. But what are you going to do if someone has an event? And we have to think about that. The event is catastrophic. And in the United States, if someone, God forbid, has a stroke because you, the doctor, put them on 45 micrograms of K2, there will be somebody in the family or somewhere that says, malpractice. So I'm very interested. Please come and tell me if anybody's doing it. I am not putting myself in that position because I don't have any colleagues in Western medicine in the United States that I know will come and defend me. So that's my answer for the United States. I think if in Europe, I think it's acceptable. Now, on the other side, the novel oral anticoagulants, I've mentioned their names. I don't think there's any problem. I think you can safely take up to any dose, 180 micrograms, because the mechanism is not through vitamin K2 inhibition, vitamin K inhibition. Does that answer it? So you can make a call to give it to them, but I'm just telling you why I don't do it. For me, the risks outweigh the benefits at this moment in time.
Very good talk. You remind me of Dr. Tim Noakes, your compatriot down there in South Africa. Yes. What's up with South Africa? You guys like to break the mold, I guess.
Especially the golfers. I mean.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, walkinlabs.com has your uncarboxylated osteocalcin test, walkinlabs.com, and your patients can drive over to either Vermont or Connecticut or New Jersey and order it up. And Dr. Bill Davis wrote the book Wheat Belly. Dr. Bill Davis has had his patients on MK7, and he has seen the progression of plaque stop and reverse.
Excellent. Thank you.
So you might want to
where is that?
Dr. Bill Davis, he's out of Milwaukee. He's a integrative medicine MD cardiologist.
And he's published regression information.
Some of the stuff he just doesn't publish.
Yeah. No, so I'm very interested to talk to him. It's very, very exciting. But we have to make sure that you've got real studies. And this is really important in the whole world of complementary medicine. People come to me and they go, you know, I know somebody who got, who they got this therapy and that therapy, and therefore I want it. There's a very big difference between empirical results and studies. I'm fascinated if we're starting to get information. It'll be wonderful. I don't understand myself mechanistically how vitamin K2 can reverse the calcification. I certainly understand how it impedes progression, but I'm very excited to go and talk to him and learn more. Thank you very much,
Thank you so much, Dr. Goodman, and I'm sure you'll be around, so we do have that about 15-minute break in the middle, and I'm sure you'll be available for questions. Professor Reid, we'll welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. Okay, I can relax. Yes. You can do. I'm not standing up here and saying I can give K2 to a patient. Of course. Do you agree with me? Because they'll say Dr. Goodman said it's okay. But even I say don't do it. You know, because I'll tell them it's okay. Of course.
There we go. Okay, I'm going to talk to you today about K2, but just from a slightly different standpoint. Now, fortunately, you just heard a very good talk on the classical thinking on K2. And what you heard about was the ability of K2, whoops, it said to be slow. Whoops, let me back up, sorry. This is not playing on my screen. Okay, what you heard about was the ability of K2, the hydrogenated form, to essentially add a carboxyl group or take in CO2 and attach it to a protein. And that allows this protein then to essentially complex calcium. By having two carboxyl groups, if you just have one, you can't hang on. If you have two, it's sort of like the person that's not too smart and he has a hold of an object and he keeps letting go, but it doesn't fall. Two groups allows you to complex and hang on and essentially take the calcium to where you want to go. Unfortunately, Dr. Goodman did a very good job of explaining why this is very important. What I want to do is move and talk to you about a different way of another mechanism for K2. Now, in a way, we're talking about sort of rediscovering the wheel here, and no pun intended for this wheel. What happened here was that K2 was proposed a long time ago, in the 50s, that K2 could actually carry out a reaction, and this particular reaction was where K2 would participate in hydrogenating NAD to NADH, making this compound. And this is proposed by Martius back in the 50s. Unfortunately, in the 60s, Johnson did some experiments to what he claimed disprove this. Now, what he did was, and I want to just explain what he did. This was back in the 60s. I'm old enough, I was president at that time. He used what's called a Warburg apparatus. Now, a Warburg apparatus is a giant machine that looks at respiration. It's very complicated. I hated it. I trained in one of these things. You had to take all these little glass pieces apart and put them all back together again, and you had to clean it out really well. And the problem really is that to do these experiments in those days, this is back in the 60s, you used tissue from animals. So what Johnson did was he used rats. He fed some of the rats K2, some of the rats were put on a diet where they would suppress their K2. And then you take the livers out of the rats, you homogenize the livers, you try to remove the mitochondria from the livers, and then you put it into this Warburg apparatus and you try to measure respiration of the mitochondria in the apparatus. Now, what I'm going to tell you is there's another way to look at this. And it's the same Warburg apparatus, but it's now, because of miniaturization and electronics and technology, we have moved to the 21st century, and now we can look at that whole process, and we can compare, and what we're going to show you is we're going to compare a new cycle for K2 versus the old cycle. They're both in action, they both work, they're both important, and that's what we're going to try to talk to you about today. Now, this study was a collaboration, Synergia Life Sciences, which is part of Veritas, and I'm at Texas Tech University. And what we looked at was to try to see, is Johnson's work correct or not? Is this really what's going on here? So, what we're going to try to show is that you have this classic cycle, the carboxylation cycle, and you're causing, this has effects on bone health, which you just heard about, arterial health, which you just heard about, but we have this redox cycle now, and the redox cycle affects cardiac health, muscle health, and nerve health. Now, this is a slide from Seahorse, which is the company that actually makes this new equipment, this new technology that allows us to look at these reactions. And basically what this is saying is that there's two really important energy pathways in a cell. One is glycolysis. Glycolysis is anaerobic metabolism. This is where you can make ATP. Now, ATP is important. ATP is, of course, as I'm sure most of you know, that's the currency, that's the energy supply that helps all the reactions take place in your body. Now, ATP is very important. You turn over your body weight in ATP in a day. Now, what does that mean? I mean, obviously, you don't make that huge amount of ATP, but what it means is ATP is just a coupling of ADP plus a phosphate, and then it comes apart. So you make ATP, and then it comes apart and goes back together. And we were just talking about this going back and forth together and coming apart. But that, you actually consume your body weight in ATP in a day. I do not have enough ATP in my arm to raise my arm. I just did it. How did I do that? I turn it on and turn it off. You have this switch, you can make ATP, you make it fast. You don't want to make it if you don't need it, and when you need it, you need it. So I can raise my arm. And that's what we're talking about here, and the mitochondria is blown up here. Mitochondria are very small. You have a lot of mitochondria in a cell. Muscle cells, of course, where you need a lot of energy. Muscle cells have lots of mitochondria. When you look at a chicken, if you eat chicken, you know that we have dark meat and light meat. The dark meat is because of mitochondria. It's the cytochromes in the mitochondria. That's why it's dark. That's why the legs are dark. Now the breast with a flying bird would be dark, but chickens don't fly anymore, and so their breasts are nice and white. They don't have mitochondria anymore. But this is where most of the energy comes from. Glycolysis makes some, but the mitochondria makes a lot. So we're talking way more. Now, a mitochondria is a primordial bacteria that was taken up by a cell. This bacteria happened to have the ability to make ATP by a certain process. This is a process, that particular bacteria, many, many, many eons ago, had that ability. So this thing lives by itself. It's sort of like a bacteria living inside every cell in your body. It lives its own life cycle. It has its own DNA. It divides. It dies. You make new. It turns over in about 3 to 10 days. So it's growing inside your cells in your body. But it is the key ingredient in your body that makes the energy you need to function. You have this other energy out here from glycolysis, but that's not enough. You couldn't escape that lion if it was chasing you, if all you had was glycolysis. You need the mitochondria. Now, here we have the mighty mitochondria. Now, the key thing you should understand about the mitochondria is that mitochondria is this bacteria. It was a bacteria that had an inner membrane and an outer membrane. Our cells only have outer membranes. We have a nuclear membrane, but we don't have this intermediate membrane that this bacteria does. So there's a membrane here, along here, if you can see that. And then there's an outer membrane out here. Now, glucose is metabolized through glycolysis, broken down into pyruvate. Pyruvate is what enters the mitochondria. It goes around the Krebs cycle. It comes in as acetyl-CoA, goes around the Krebs cycle, and this is what produces the NADH that you need to make the ATP. And the process, I hope I'm not belaboring this too much, but the process is that this interacts with a protein, with different proteins, these proteins right along here, that are membrane bound. These are proteins that are stuck in the membrane, this inner membrane, and when it interacts, this allows protons, or hydrogen ions, to move into this inner space out here. So each step along the way, you're causing the protons to move into this inner space of the mitochondria. Now, a key player in this whole process is coenzyme Q. That's right here, Q with the queen standing there. Coenzyme Q participates here, 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 causes changes in your cytochromes, which also then participates here. So that's a key player, and what's going on here is by pumping, this pumps these protons, so it uses the energy from glucose coming in as pyruvate to pump these hydrogen ions into this inner space in the mitochondria. They build up, and then they can flow down through this enzyme, ATP synthase, and make ATP. And this is where the ATP comes from that you need for your energy. So it's this flow of protons coming through from this inner space that allows this pump to work and make ATP. Now, here's the next step. Vitamin K. Vitamin K, we're proposing, comes in here and replaces or helps your coenzyme Q to do this process. Why would one propose such a thing? Well, let's look at the structures of coenzyme Q and vitamin K. Here's K2. Look at this part of K2 over here. This is the part I want you to focus on for the moment. This is almost identical with this part of coenzyme Q, CoQ. Those two oxygens, when you saw that KH2 going to K, the H's come in here at these two oxygens, here and here, here and here. CoQ does the same thing. It goes through the same process of going back and forth between the reduced form, or having those hydrogens on it, and the oxidized form, where you don't have the hydrogens on it. This is the oxidized form of these two molecules. You can see that this part is different on CoQ from the same part over here on vitamin K, but structurally, these are very, very similar molecules. So now, is that happening? Well, let's see. Okay, this slide is provided by Seahorse. Seahorse makes this machine. Now this machine is neat because what's the difference now between what we can do and what we did and what Johnson did back in the 60s? Johnson, remember, had to take out the rat's liver, homogenize it, take the mitochondria out of that, stick it in the machine, and analyze it. What we can do is we take little 96-well plates, we grow human cells in those plates. So these are living human cells. They're not disturbed. We can do 96 experiments at a time, very fast. Nice thing about technology. Stick this in the machine, analyze the respiration that's taking place in those cells, those living cells in the machine. And what we're looking at then is, this is that pathway, that same pathway from the mitochondria right here. These are the proteins stuck in the membrane. This is the membrane right here, this part right here. That's the membrane. And so we're going to analyze what is going on in that membrane. So the first step we're going to look at is basal respiration. How much oxygen are those cells taking up? Now, this is basal. So those of you that are still awake, this is where you sort of are. If you're asleep, you're really at basal levels. This is where you are right now. You're just kind of sitting there, relaxing, looking at your basal levels. Now, at this point, we can add essentially a poison, oligomycin. Oligomycin now blocks, this is that pump over here where the protons come down through, or the hydrogen ions come down through this pump and drive the production of ATP. So this is the ATP production. So by adding this oligomycin, what we're looking at is ATP production while these cells are at rest, while they're just sitting there at rest. So this is how much ATP those cells can produce. Now, if we add another compound, FCCP, which is basically what this is this is a compound that can punch holes in membranes, allow things to flow through a membrane. It's called an ionophore. It allows those protons now, those hydrogen ions, to flow through that membrane. Here they are right over here. They're flowing through that membrane. And essentially, what that means is you've got these reactions going on over here, still going on, pumping protons out here, and they're flowing right back in. So this thing's just spinning its wheels. So it's just going round and round and round. And what that means is that now it's spinning its wheels, and we're now looking at the maximum level that those cells can possibly pump protons out, which is the way they make ATP. So now we're looking at the maximum energy consumption, the maximum oxygen consumption, or the maximum energy output that those cells can make. So that's what these steps tell us. So now this is when someone yells fire in this room and everyone has to run out of here. You zoom up to here. You want your maximum output. This is how much you can respond, how you can use your muscles and move at your maximum rate. So then we can actually block over here with two other poisons and actually take us down to basal levels. Now this red down at the bottom, that's non-mitochondrial respiration by the cells. So there is some non-mitochondrial respiration, not much, just this small amount down here. And this little bit over here, this is your leakage. This is the amount of leakage, sort of. So when we blocked ATP production, we just came down to here. There's a little bit of leakage of protons out of this thing. Okay, now we're ready for the experiment, finally, after all that. So if you're still with me, here we go. Vitamin K2, what happens when we add K2 to those cells? Look at this. We've improved our resting level. In other words, you'd be sitting there more alert. You probably wouldn't have as big a tendency to fall asleep while I'm talking about this biochemistry. Anyway, but this is the key over here. Look at the increase in our maximum consumption, our maximum output levels. K2 zoomed this up. We're now at a much higher level here so now we have much improved ability for those cells to do something. Now obviously we had to do this with chemicals because we can't cause those cells to run or do something because they're just sitting there in a little thing. But this is what K2 could do. And now if we go to K1, we can see K1 does a similar thing, not as well, not quite as well, but similar process, because K1 looks very similar to K2. So now can we translate this to the real world? Does this really work? So fortunately, this study was carried out by Synergy and Veritas to get this to see what happens in the real world. So we got a kinesiologist over at North Texas to take 19 healthy young volunteers and see what happens when we put them on a high K2 diet for just 6 weeks. 6 weeks on a high K2 diet to see what that does to these. Now these people are not told to exercise, they're just doing their normal life. And what we see is that in those 6 weeks, they went from 17 to 24 in their maximum cardiac output. That's a 40% increase in maximum cardiac output. They have a 6% or 9%, pardon me, increase in maximum oxygen consumption. Now 9% may not sound like much, but what Brian tells us is that 9% is equivalent to strenuous exercise for 6 months to get that much improvement. So you see, just by taking K2, you got 6 months worth of hard exercise in the gym. Now, I'm not saying you should do away with exercise, but this means that you can make your mitochondria much more efficient by just the input of K2. So now let's go to muscle health. You heard about the arteries and things of this kind, but does this really translate? Does this type of thing work too for the muscles? So what they're looking at here is muscle cramps. Now it turns out people over 60, 30% of people over 60 have muscle cramps. Over 80, 50% of people over 80 experience muscle cramps. Different diseases. Hypo and hyperthyroidism can cause muscle cramps. Myopathies can cause muscle cramps. Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis. Many people suffer from muscle cramps, so your muscles aren't functioning properly. Now, Dr. Mehta with Veritas did a study, and they wanted to see, is there an effect of K2 on muscle cramps? So they took patients that had 2 or more cramps per week, and this had gone on for at least 3 months. And they were brought into this study to study muscle cramps with K2. They were given 100 micrograms a day for 3 months. And the patients kept a diary as to how often they had muscle cramps. Oops. These are how many was enrolled and completed the study. And what we find, they actually wound up dividing them into two groups. One group had 2 to 5 cramps a day. That's quite a few muscle cramps. The second group had 2 to 5 a week. And those are the two groups. What they found was that the group that had 2 to 5 per day, within 3 months, went down to just about 0. 2 to 5 per week also went down to 0, just by taking K2. So they went from an unbearable distress to essentially normal in 3 months with K2. How about nerve health? Again, blood perfusion, hypoxia. What went on here was they decided to look at peripheral neuropathy. This, again, another study carried out by Dr. Mehta with Veritas. They looked at diabetics that have a lot of peripheral neuropathy. Looked at megaloblastic anemia, also a lot of, those are the main two in this study, it turns out, for the effect of vitamin K2 on this problem. So here's the study. They started off just to see if there was any, if it could be tolerated, if you could have the toleration of this material. And then secondary objective was to see, is there any change? They started off with 100 micrograms twice a day. They were going to change if there was not, if they didn't see any type of improvement. We're going to switch to 350. This was not necessary, so really it just went down this arm of the study. What was found was that they went from, these are people that in many cases couldn't even stand up. They were under a lot of distress. You can see here, in 4 weeks, they went to where essentially no pain or very, very little pain from just by taking K2, 100 micrograms twice a day. So what we're proposing is that there's now sort of, we've rediscovered what was proposed back in the 50s, so it's not a new discovery, but it's proof that that proposal back in the 50s was real, that indeed there is a role, another new role for K2. This new role brings in the redox cycle. So we have the carboxylation cycle and we have the redox cycle. And both these cycles work together. They both play a role in K2 in the body. And this actually translates into better health for people. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Reid. Wonderful information there. We've got time for questions. We'll start up here.
Have you compared the CoQ10 with MK7 in that same assay? Would it do the same thing if you added CoQ10 for the same amount, or would it be synergistic?
I haven't tried that. You mean the other studies that were done?
The study that showed improved energetics of the electron transport system. Did you compare
No,
with
CoQ10?
How do you think it would compare with adding CoQ10 to that assay?
Don't know, but don't know. Have to find out. What was interesting was that we used a small amount of K2 for that study. We didn't have a lot, but you're right. What we're actually doing right now is we're doing studies on different isomers of K2, because as you know, there's different stereoisomers that are possible that you can get in a lot of the preparations. So we're very interested in the stereochemistry and looking at that. But you're right, we'll try the CoQ, see what that does and if there's synergism when we add those together. We should be able to translate sort of based on blood volume and things of this kind, how much you would need, yes.
Okay, we have another question.
You showed some charts on when you were talking about muscle improvement and neuropathy. Mm-hmm. And if I recall, it was 2 and 4 weeks where the results were dramatic. How often did you read the, did you do it daily? Did you do it weekly?
Oh, these were diaries kept by the patients as to how they improved during that time. This, the study here you're thinking about is this one. Oops, sorry. Oops, there. Yeah, they kept.
Was their diary a daily diary or a weekly diary?
Daily.
Daily. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a nice talk. Again, it's Ben Yini from University of Kansas Medical Center. I have some questions. One is, I noticed that your seahorse data is from the neuroblastoma cells, there's a cancer cell. And then do you have any data from the normal muscle cell? Or in your neuroblastoma cells, I know because this kind of meeting you don't talk much about your research data, but I'm curious how about the ATP level after you added vitamin K2 in that experiment?
Oh, we haven't done it yet.
Okay.
Sorry.
And do you have any data from the normal muscle cells doing that seahorse data?
We just used that. Actually what happened was this is part of a study we were interested in brain aging.
Okay.
And so at the time we were interested in effects on things like Alzheimer's, and that's why we were doing the work with the neuroblastoma cells, which is a human brain tumor.
Okay. In terms of the mechanism for that increased spare OCR, and then do you think is that due to vitamin K2, the structural similarity, and then to enhance the CoQ function, or just to replace it? What kind of mechanism you think?
We don't know yet. That's a huge, interesting study that we're planning to do. But this is all very new.
On your slide with regards to the muscle cramping and on the neuropathy, it would have been fascinating to see the phenytoin A levels before and after, because it seems to be implied that MK7 has a positive impact on the balance of phenytoin A in the body. And you might want to take a look at that in the future.
Good suggestion.
A question up here? Right over there.
So talking about your muscle cramp study for a brief minute, you showed with, I guess what I'd call chronic use, 100 micrograms over 4 months, you saw a significant reduction in muscle cramps in these people. Would you expect to see any sort of a similar effect if you looked at a more acute response, like per se taking it, an athlete taking it before a soccer match? Would you expect to see an acute effect that they might reduce their potential for getting cramps, or is it something that they would also have to take in a chronic fashion, more in a daily use, in order to reduce the potential for cramps and something like that?
It would appear to have to be daily use because the data didn't drop to zero right away. So you would imagine it would have to be used all over a period of time to build up the levels to where you would.
Okay, yeah, my thought was, since the fact that they were...
they're healthy, so maybe not.
Yeah, that they were prone to cramps to the point where they were going to have them, and they went from having quite a bit to having none, and an athlete might have a 5 or 10% chance of getting cramps if you be able to bring that down anymore. So.
Yeah, we don't have the points for the, well, for like the study where we were looking at the ability of the mitochondria to actually improve. That, unfortunately, we don't have the intermediate points. So we don't know. We don't know, did that go up right away, as you're asking, which is a good question, or did it go up over time? Don't know.
Excellent. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Hi, on the slide with the 600 micrograms, I'm curious if it was tied to, with context to endurance athletes, cyclists, marathon runners. Did you see any increase in, say, VO2 max level or wattage output over sustained time?
That's now, apparently there's more studies being done, and as I understand, there's results coming out right now that says this works in a larger group, but I don't know if this is, I think it's still normal people, not high output athletes yet. Obviously, there's a lot of things to look at here.
So many more things to take a look at. Well, thank you so much, Professor Reid. Really appreciate it. We are at our break. We will reconvene at 10:10, and I'm sure our speakers are around if you have any questions for them.